The first rays of dawn filtered through the canopy of lodgepole pines, casting dappled light across the forest floor of Wyoming's Bridger-Teton National Forest. Ethan Reed rolled over in his sleeping bag, his arm instinctively reaching for Clara, his wife of just 6 days. The thin synthetic fabric of their lightweight backpacking tent rustled with his movement, a sound barely distinguishable from the gentle morning breeze that swept through the surrounding woods. "Morning, beautiful," Ethan whispered, pressing a kiss to Clara's temple as she stirred beside him. Her dark hair was tousled from sleep, and she smiled without opening her eyes, nestling closer to his warmth. "Already," she murmured, her voice thick with lingering dreams. "Sun's just coming up," Ethan replied, propping himself up on one elbow to peer through the mesh window at the top of their tent. The sky was transforming from the deep blue of night to a pale, misty morning gray. Perfect timing for breakfast and that hike to Pinnacle Peak we planned. Clara's eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of burnished amber. "I'm starving," she admitted with a small laugh. "Those trail bars last night weren't exactly the wedding feast I imagined when you said honeymoon dinner." Ethan grinned, running a hand through his own sandy brown hair. "Well, Mrs. Reed, I promise to make it up to you with a 5-star breakfast of dehydrated eggs and instant coffee." She poked him playfully in the ribs. "Such luxury, I'm truly blessed." Their laughter mingled in the cool morning air as they both sat up, shivering slightly as they emerged from the warmth of their sleeping bags. The temperature had dropped considerably overnight, a reminder that early June in the Wyoming mountains still carried the bite of spring rather than the warmth of summer. "I'll get the stove going," Ethan said, reaching for the tent zipper. "You want to grab the food bag?" Clara nodded, stretching her arms above her head with a satisfying yawn. "It's just outside, right?" Ethan paused, his hand on the zipper. A flicker of guilt crossed his features. Actually, I think I left the bag in the vestibule last night. It was starting to rain when we finished dinner, and I didn't feel like walking to the bear hang in the dark." Clara's stretching arms dropped to her sides. "Ethan," she said, her voice carrying a note of gentle reproach, "the ranger specifically told us—" I know, he cut in, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Food needs to be properly stored at least 100 yards from the campsite, preferably hung 15 feet high between 2 trees. Bear Country 101. So why didn't you do it?" Ethan shrugged, a sheepish smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Because it was cold and rainy, and I wanted to get back to my beautiful new wife. Come on, it's just one night. What are the chances a bear would find our exact campsite among thousands of acres of wilderness?" Clara shook her head, but her expression softened. She'd known Ethan since their sophomore year at the University of Colorado in Boulder, where they'd met during an ecology seminar. His occasional tendency to bend rules for convenience was nothing new, though she'd always been the more cautious of the pair. It was part of why they balanced each other so well, her methodical nature complementing his spontaneity. "Well, let's get it properly stored after breakfast," she said firmly. "We're here for 4 more days, and I'd rather not have our honeymoon interrupted by wildlife." "Yes, ma'am," Ethan replied with an exaggerated salute. He unzipped the tent door and crawled out into the vestibule, a small covered area created by the rainfly extending beyond the main tent. The vestibule was just large enough to store their hiking boots and backpacks, protecting them from the elements while keeping the main sleeping area clean and dry. Ethan immediately spotted their food bag, a blue waterproof sack designed to keep their provisions dry, sitting exactly where he'd left it the night before. He reached for it, already planning the breakfast he would prepare on their small camping stove. That's when he heard it, a deep huffing sound that stopped his hand mid-air. The sound came again, followed by the unmistakable scrape of claws against earth. Ethan's blood ran cold as he slowly, very slowly, turned his head toward the source of the noise. Not 10 yards away, partially obscured by a cluster of young pines, stood a massive grizzly bear. Time seemed to freeze. Ethan remained perfectly still, his breath caught in his throat, his heart hammering against his ribcage with such force he was certain it would burst. The bear, a male Ethan guessed from its size, was enormous, standing at least 7 feet tall at the shoulder. Its fur was a mix of brown and silver, giving it the grizzled appearance that had earned the species its name. The creature's powerful shoulders bunched as it lowered, its snout to the ground, sniffing intently in the direction of the campsite, in the direction of the food bag, just inches from Ethan's outstretched hand. "Clara," Ethan whispered, so softly it was barely audible even to himself. "Don't move." Inside the tent, Clara had been about to follow Ethan out when she heard the tension in his voice. She froze, one hand on the sleeping bag, her body suddenly alert with alarm. "What is it?" she whispered back. "Bear," Ethan replied, the single word conveying the gravity of their situation. "Grizzly, big one." Clara's breath caught. Her mind raced through everything she'd ever learned about bear encounters. They'd both taken wilderness first aid courses before this trip, had read all the recommended safety guidelines. The information was ingrained. Don't run, don't scream, avoid direct eye contact, appear non-threatening but maintain awareness, back away slowly if possible, play dead only as a last resort if attacked. But all that assumed you weren't trapped in a flimsy nylon tent with a grizzly between you and any possible escape route. The bear huffed again, its massive head swinging, toward the vestibule where Ethan remained frozen, its small intelligent eyes fixed directly on him. The creature's nostrils flared as it caught the scent of the food bag, and perhaps of Ethan himself. In that moment, Ethan knew he had made a catastrophic error. The one rule you never broke in bear country, proper food storage, and he'd ignored, say it for convenience. Now as the grizzly took a lumbering step toward the tent, Ethan felt the weight of his mistake crushing down on him with the inevitability of an avalanche. "Bear spray," Clara breathed from inside the tent. "In your pack." Ethan's pack was indeed in the vestibule with him, leaning against the side opposite from where he now crouched. The bear spray, a high-pressure canister of capsaicin designed specifically as a bear deterrent, was in an outer pocket, easily accessible for exactly this type of situation. If he could reach it without triggering the bear's predatory instincts, moving with glacial slowness, Ethan began to shift his weight, inching his right hand away from the food bag and toward his backpack. The grizzly watched him, its head cocked slightly to one side. It took another step forward, now just 7 yards away. "I'm going to try for the spray," Ethan whispered. "If something happens, stay in the tent until it's gone, then use the satellite phone to call for help." "Ethan, no," Clara began, but he was already moving, his hand creeping toward the pack with painful deliberation. The bear, perhaps sensing Ethan's intention or simply growing impatient, suddenly rose onto its hind legs, an intimidation display that put its full terrifying size on view. It towered over the campsite, its massive paws hanging in front of its chest, razor-sharp claws gleaming in the early morning light. Then it dropped back to all fours and charged. Everything happened at once. Ethan lunged for his pack, fingers scrabbling desperately for the pocket containing the bear spray. Clara screamed his name from inside the tent. The grizzly closed the distance with shocking speed, its powerful legs eating up the ground between them. Ethan's fingers closed around the canister of bear spray just as the grizzly reached the vestibule. He whipped it out, fumbling with the safety cap as the bear's massive form blocked out the light. He aimed and pressed the trigger, praying. He wasn't too late. A cloud of orange spray erupted from the canister, catching the bear directly in the face. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The grizzly reared back with a roar of pain and confusion, pawing frantically at its eyes and snout. "Clara, run!" Ethan shouted, scrambling backward into the tent. "Out the back, now!" Their tent had a small emergency exit at the rear, designed for situations where the main entrance might be compromised. Clara was already moving, unzipping the rear door with shaking hands. Ethan continued spraying as he backed in, creating a barrier of capsaicin between themselves and the enraged bear. But the vestibule was small, the bear was large, and the spray, while effective, wasn't an impenetrable shield. As Ethan turned to follow Clara through the rear exit, the grizzly lashed out blindly with one massive paw, tearing through the thin fabric of the tent wall and catching Ethan across his upper back. Pain exploded across Ethan's shoulder blades as the bear's claws ripped through his thermal shirt and into his flesh. He cried out, stumbling forward into Clara, who had just cleared the rear door. "Ethan!" she screamed, catching him as he fell against her. "Oh God, oh God!" "Keep going," Ethan gasped, the searing pain nearly overwhelming him. "Don't stop." Behind them, the grizzly was thrashing in the vestibule, still blinded and disoriented by the bear spray, but destroying the tent in its confusion and rage. The sound of ripping fabric and snapping tent poles filled the air, punctuated by the bear's guttural vocalizations. Clara helped Ethan to his feet, her face pale with shock and fear. Blood was already seeping through the back of his shirt, spreading in dark, irregular patterns. Together they staggered away from the ruined tent, heading toward a stand of denser trees about 50 yards away. The food, Ethan managed through gritted teeth. It wants the food. Once it finds the bag, it might leave us alone. Clara nodded, her eyes wide with terror but her movements purposeful. She supported Ethan as they picked their way across the uneven ground, both acutely aware of the bear still, rampaging through their campsite behind them. They reached the trees, and Clara helped Ethan sit with his back against a thick pine trunk. His face was ashen, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Clara carefully peeled back the torn fabric of his shirt, revealing 3 long, parallel gashes across his upper back, from his right shoulder blade to just above his left kidney. "How bad?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with pain. It's not good," Clara admitted, fighting to keep her voice steady. "But I don't think it hit anything vital. The bleeding isn't pulsing." She swallowed hard, trying to recall her wilderness first aid training through the haze of adrenaline and fear. "I need to stop the bleeding and clean the wounds." But their first aid kit was in the tent with the bear. A crash from the direction of their campsite drew their attention. The grizzly had apparently found the food bag and was now tearing through their supplies, scattering packages of dehydrated meals, energy bars, and trail mix across the forest floor. "The satellite phone," Ethan said suddenly. "Where is it?" Clara's hand flew to her mouth. "In my pack, in the vestibule." They stared at each other, the full gravity of their situation sinking in. They were deep in the backcountry, at least 15 miles from the nearest trailhead. Ethan was injured and losing blood. Their shelter, food, and communication device were all being destroyed by an angry grizzly bear, and they had no idea how long the bear would remain at their campsite or if it would eventually come looking for them. "We need to get help," Clara said, her initial panic giving way to a kind of focused determination. "I'll have to go back for the phone once the bear leaves." "No way," Ethan protested, wincing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain across his back. "Too dangerous. We stick together, head for the trail. Someone will be coming through eventually." Clara shook her head. "That could be days, Ethan. Your wounds need proper treatment, and soon." She glanced back toward their campsite, where the sounds of destruction had momentarily ceased. "I'll be careful. I'll wait until the bear is gone." Before Ethan could argue further, the pain in his back intensified suddenly, causing him to gasp and slump more heavily against the tree. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. "Stay with me, Ethan," Clara urged, cupping his face in her hands. "Stay awake." Ethan forced his eyes open, focusing on Clara's face, the face he'd fallen in love with during that ecology seminar 6 years ago, the face he'd watched across the altar less than a week before as they'd exchanged their vows. "Not going anywhere," he managed, attempting a smile. "Promised for better or worse, remember." A tear slipped down Clara's cheek as she nodded. "This definitely qualifies as worse." She stroked his hair back from his forehead, her fingers coming away damp with sweat. "We're going to get through this, okay? We're going to get help." Ethan nodded weakly, saving his strength. In the distance, they could hear the bear moving around their campsite, occasionally grunting or huffing as it continued to investigate the remains of their equipment and supplies. Clara tore strips from the bottom of her own thermal shirt, creating makeshift bandages which she carefully pressed against Ethan's wounds. The fabric quickly soaked through with blood, but it was better than nothing. "I need to elevate your feet," she said, slipping into the clinical tone she'd learned during their first aid courses. "You might be going into shock." She gathered fallen pine boughs, arranging them into a small pile, then carefully helped Ethan lie down with his feet, propped up on the improvised cushion. His face was growing paler by the minute, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Clara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "if the bear comes back—" "It won't," she said firmly, though she had no way of knowing if that was true. "It got what it wanted, our food." Ethan's eyes fluttered closed, then opened again with visible effort. "I'm so sorry," he murmured. "This is my fault. If I'd just hung the food bag properly—" "Stop," Clara cut him off, laying a finger gently against his lips. "Save your strength. We can play the blame game after we get you to a hospital." A sudden crash from the direction of their campsite made them both start. The bear was on the move again, and from the sound of it, heading in their general direction. Clara's heart raced as she quickly considered their options. They couldn't outrun a bear under the best of circumstances. let alone with Ethan injured. They had no weapons, no bear spray, nowhere to hide. If the grizzly found them, play dead, Ethan whispered, evidently following the same line of thought. If it attacks, play dead. Curl up, protect your head and neck, lie still. Clara nodded, though the prospect filled her with dread. She'd read the statistics, knew that playing dead could work with a grizzly defending its food or cubs, but was also aware that nothing guaranteed survival in a bear attack. The crashing grew louder, accompanied by the sound of snapping branches and the grizzly's distinctive huffing breaths. Clara positioned herself protectively in front of Ethan, her body tense with fear, but her mind strangely clear. If the bear came for them, she would do whatever was necessary to save her husband, even if that meant becoming a target herself. But just as the sounds seemed to be converging on their location, they abruptly changed direction, moving away toward the east. Clara held her breath, scarcely daring to hope, as the noises grew fainter, and eventually faded altogether. I think it's gone, she whispered, after several minutes of silence. At least for now. Ethan nodded weakly, his eyelids growing heavy. The satellite phone, he mumbled. Need to call for help. Clara glanced back toward their destroyed campsite, now visible through the trees in the strengthening morning light. The bear was nowhere to be seen, but the devastation it had left behind was clear. Their tent was in tatters, supplies scattered across the small clearing. I'm going to check if the phone survived, she told Ethan, already rising to her feet. I'll be right back. Be careful, Ethan urged, his voice faint but insistent. If you see or hear anything at all, you get back here immediately. Clara nodded, squeezed his hand once, then began making her way cautiously back toward the campsite, every sense on high alert for any sign of the bear's return. The scene that greeted her was one of complete chaos. Their lightweight backpacking tent, which had withstood mountain storms during previous trips, had been reduced to shredded nylon and bent aluminum poles. Their sleeping bags had been dragged out and torn apart, synthetic fillings scattered like bizarre snow across the forest floor. Food packaging was everywhere. Some items partially eaten, others simply crushed and abandoned. Clara moved carefully through the debris, eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest for movement. Her backpack lay on its side near what remained of the tent's rear wall, the top flap open and some of the contents spilled out. With trembling hands, she reached for it, praying the satellite phone had survived. The side pocket where she usually kept the device was empty. Clara's heart sank as she began searching more frantically through the scattered belongings, pushing aside torn clothing and broken equipment. Finally, she spotted it, a small black object, half buried under the remains of their sleeping pad. The satellite phone appeared intact, its sturdy case having protected it from the bear's destruction. Clara grabbed it, clutching it to her chest like a lifeline. With one last nervous glance around the devastated campsite, she hurried back to Ethan. He was just as she'd left him, lying with his eyes closed, his face waxy and pale. For one terrifying moment, Clara feared he had lost consciousness, but as she knelt beside him, his eyes fluttered open. Found it, she said, holding up the phone. It looks okay. Relief washed over Ethan's features. Thank God, he breathed. Called to rescue, tell them grizzly attack. Clara nodded, already powering on the device. They'd registered it before their trip, setting up the emergency contact information and familiarizing themselves with the procedure for calling for help. She had never imagined they would actually need to use it. The phone came to life, its small screen illuminating in the shade of the pine grove. Clara selected the emergency function and pressed the call button, holding her breath as the device searched for a satellite signal. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, the connection was established. A calm professional voice answered, asking for the nature of the emergency. This is Clara Reed, she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her racing heart. My husband and I are in the Bridger Teton National Forest, approximately 15 miles northeast of the Green River Lakes trailhead. We've been attacked by a grizzly bear. My husband is injured, lacerations to his upper. Back from the bear's claws, he's losing blood and may be going into shock. The dispatcher asked several follow-up questions, their exact coordinates, which Clara was able to provide from the GPS function on the satellite phone. The extent of Ethan's injuries, whether the bear was still in the area, and their current situation regarding shelter and supplies. We have no shelter, Clara explained, glancing back toward their ruined campsite. The bear destroyed our tent and scattered our supplies. We have the clothes we're wearing and this satellite phone, that's it. Understood, the dispatcher replied. I'm dispatching a helicopter rescue team from Jackson Hole. They should reach your location in approximately 40 minutes to 1 hour. In the meantime, keep pressure on your husband's wounds and try to keep him warm. Do you have any means of signaling the helicopter when it arrives? Clara thought quickly, her eyes scanning their surroundings. No flares or anything like that, but I can use the reflecting surface of the phone to signal them if the sun's out. That's good thinking, the dispatcher approved. The pilot will be looking for any sign of your location. Is there a clearing nearby where the helicopter could land? Clara described the small meadow about 100 yards from their current position. Not ideal, but potentially large enough for a helicopter to touch down. Stay on the line as long as possible, the dispatcher instructed. If you need to disconnect to conserve battery, that's understandable, but try to check in every 15 minutes if you can. I will, Clara promised. She turned back to Ethan, who had been listening to her side of the conversation with half-lidded eyes. Help is coming, she told him, taking his hand in hers. Helicopter from Jackson Hole. Less than an hour. Ethan managed a weak smile. My hero, he murmured. Clara squeezed his hand, fighting back tears. The adrenaline that had carried her through the initial crisis was beginning to ebb, leaving her shaky and overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had happened and what could have happened. How's your back? She asked, gently turning him slightly to check the makeshift bandages she'd applied. They were soaked through with blood, but the bleeding seemed to have slowed somewhat. Hurts, Ethan admitted, but I've had worse. Clara raised an eyebrow skeptically. When, exactly, have you had worse than a grizzly bear using your back as, say, a scratching post? Ethan's lips quirked upward. Remember that time in college when I tried to impress you by skateboarding down the library steps? Despite everything, Clara found herself laughing. You broke your ankle and got a concussion. Exactly. Way worse. She shook her head, marveling at his ability to joke even now. It was one of the things she loved most about him, his irrepressible optimism, his refusal to be defeated by circumstances. Just hang in there, she said softly, brushing his hair back from his forehead. The helicopter's coming, you're going to be fine. Ethan nodded, his eyelids drooping again. Clara watched him with growing concern. His skin was clammy to the touch, his breathing shallow. The signs of shock were becoming more pronounced. She updated the dispatcher, who advised her to continue monitoring Ethan's condition and to try to keep him as warm as possible. Clara removed her own jacket, draping it over Ethan despite his weak protests. You need it more than I do, she insisted. I can move around to stay warm. You need to stay still. The next 45 minutes were among the longest of Clara's life. She alternated between checking on Ethan, scanning the skies for any sign of the rescue helicopter, and nervously watching the surrounding forest for the grizzly's return. The sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows through the trees and warming the air to a more comfortable temperature. Ethan drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes responding to Clara's questions with short answers, other times seeming to not hear her at all. She kept talking to him nonetheless, reminiscing about their time together in college, their wedding the previous weekend, the plans they'd made for the future, anything to keep him connected to her, to keep him fighting. Finally, just as Clara was beginning to fear the worst, she heard it, the distant thump-thump-thump of helicopter blades cutting through the mountain air. She leapt to her feet, her heart soaring with hope. "They're coming, Ethan!" she exclaimed, squeezing his hand. "Do you hear that? The helicopter's coming." Ethan's eyes opened, focusing on her face with effort. "Told you we'd make it," he murmured. Clara pressed a kiss to his forehead, then grabbed the satellite phone. "I need to signal them," she explained. "I'll be right back." She spoke quickly to the dispatcher, confirming that the sound she was hearing was indeed the rescue helicopter. Then, clutching the satellite phone, Clara made her way to the edge of the tree line, where she would have a better view of the sky. The helicopter appeared over the ridgeline to the west, a sleek red and white shape against the blue Wyoming sky. Clara immediately began signaling, with the phone's reflective surface, angling it to catch the sun's rays and direct them toward the aircraft. For several heart-stopping moments, the helicopter continued on its course, seemingly unaware of her presence. Clara signaled more frantically, waving her free arm above her head in desperation. Then, miraculously, the helicopter banked slightly, altering its path to head directly toward her position. Clara nearly sobbed with relief. They had seen her. Help was coming. The aircraft circled once, the downdraft from its rotors whipping Clara's hair around her face, before moving toward the small meadow she had described. Clara watched as it descended carefully, the pilot expertly maneuvering in the confined space. As soon as the helicopter touched down, two figures in bright orange jumpsuits emerged, carrying medical equipment. Clara waved to attract their attention, then pointed toward the grove of pines where Ethan lay waiting. The rescue medics, a man and a woman, jogged toward her, their expressions professional and focused. "Clara Reed?" the woman called as they approached. Clara nodded, already turning to lead them to Ethan. "Yes, my husband's over here. Grizzly attack. Claws caught his upper back." The medics followed her to Ethan's side, immediately setting down their gear and beginning their assessment. The female medic, whose name tag read Martinez, checked Ethan's vital signs while her partner, Dawson, carefully examined the wounds on his back. "He's lost a good amount of blood," Martinez observed, wrapping a blood pressure cuff around Ethan's arm. "BP's 90-60, pulse 120 and thready, definite hypovolemic shock." Dawson nodded grimly as he inspected the lacerations. 3 deep parallel lacerations across the upper back, approximately 8 to 10 inches in length. Some muscle damage evident, but no apparent spinal involvement. "We need to get him stabilized for transport." They worked with practiced efficiency, inserting an IV line to begin replacing Ethan's lost fluids, cleaning and properly dressing his wounds, and preparing him for the flight to the hospital. Clara hovered nearby, answering their questions about the attack and Ethan's medical history. "How long ago did this happen?" Martinez asked as she administered something through Ethan's IV. Clara glanced at her, watch surprised to realize how much time had passed. "About 2 hours now, I think. It was just after dawn." "And you're sure it was a grizzly?" "Positive. Brown fur with silver tips, pronounced shoulder hump, dish-shaped face profile. Much bigger than a black bear." Martinez nodded, seemingly impressed by Clara's identification. "You did a good job with initial care," she said, nodding toward the makeshift bandages Clara had fashioned. "Probably saved him from going into more severe shock." Clara felt a rush of gratitude for those wilderness first aid courses they'd taken, even as guilt gnawed at her over the mistake that had led to this situation in the first place. "Will he be okay?" she asked, her voice catching. Dawson looked up from where he was securing Ethan to a collapsible stretcher. "His vital signs are stabilizing with the fluids," he said reassuringly. "The wounds are serious, but don't appear life-threatening. He'll need surgery to clean and repair. The lacerations, possibly some minor reconstruction of the damaged muscle tissue, but with proper treatment, he should recover well." Relief washed over Clara like a physical force, leaving her suddenly light-headed. Martinez noticed immediately, guiding her to sit down before she could fall. "When was the last time you ate or drank anything?" the medic asked, pressing a bottle of water into Clara's hands. Clara tried to remember. "Last night. Trail mix and jerky for dinner. Take small." "Zips," Martinez instructed, watching as Clara complied. "You're probably dehydrated and coming down from an adrenaline crash. We'll get you both taken care of." Once Ethan was secured to the stretcher, the medics carefully lifted him and began carrying him toward the waiting helicopter. Clara followed, still clutching the water bottle, her legs shaky but determined. "Are there any of your belongings you need to retrieve before we leave?" Dawson asked over his shoulder. Clara thought of their destroyed campsite, the shredded tent and scattered supplies. Nothing there was worth delaying Ethan's treatment for. "No," she said firmly, "just get us out of here." The medics nodded, continuing toward the helicopter. As they approached, the pilot, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, stepped out to help load Ethan into the aircraft. "Any sign of the bear?" he asked as they secured the stretcher inside. Clara shook her head. "Not since it left our campsite about 2 hours ago. It headed east." The pilot nodded, making a mental note. "I'll radio that information to the rangers. They'll want to monitor the area, make sure it doesn't pose a threat to other hikers." Once Ethan was safely aboard, Martinez helped Clara into the helicopter and instructed her on how to fasten the specialized harness. The interior was cramped but meticulously organized, with medical equipment secured to every available surface. "We'll be flying to St. John's Medical Center in Jackson Hole," Martinez explained as she checked Clara's harness. "It's about a 20-minute flight. Your husband will be taken directly to the emergency department for assessment, then likely to surgery to repair his wounds." Clara nodded, her gaze fixed on Ethan's pale face. He seemed more alert now, the IV fluids already helping to stabilize his condition. He managed a weak smile as his eyes met hers. "Some honeymoon, huh?" he mouthed over the noise of the rotors as the pilot prepared for takeoff. Clara reached across the small space between them, taking his hand in hers. "Never a dull moment with you, Reed," she replied, squeezing his fingers. The helicopter lifted, off, rising smoothly above the small meadow and banking toward the south. Clara looked down at the wilderness below, the vast expanse of Bridger Teton National Forest stretching to the horizon in all directions. Somewhere down there, a grizzly bear was going about its day, unaware of the havoc it had wreaked on their lives in just a few terrifying minutes. The enormity of what they had survived began to sink in. They had faced one of North America's most formidable predators and lived to tell the tale. Ethan was injured but would recover. They had lost their gear but not their lives. And somewhere in this experience was a story they would someday tell, perhaps to their children, perhaps to friends around a campfire far from bear country. But for now, Clara was content to hold Ethan's hand as the helicopter carried them to safety, leaving the wilderness and its dangers behind. The flight to Jackson Hole passed in a blur for Clara. She remained beside Ethan, holding his hand whenever the medics weren't tending to him, speaking encouragement when his eyes were open, and silently thanking whatever forces had allowed them both to survive. Below them, the rugged landscape of western Wyoming unfolded, dense forests giving way to alpine meadows, jagged peaks still capped with late spring snow, and eventually the more developed areas surrounding Jackson Hole. As they approached the town, Clara caught glimpses of the Snake River winding through the valley, the ski slopes of Snow King Mountain, and finally the hospital itself, a modern complex nestled against the backdrop of the Teton Range. The helicopter settled onto the designated landing pad atop St. John's Medical Center with barely a bump. Immediately, the side door was pulled open from the outside, and a team of medical personnel stood ready to receive them. The transition from helicopter to hospital happened with dizzying speed. Ethan was whisked away on his stretcher, surrounded by doctors and nurses speaking in rapid medical shorthand that Clara couldn't fully follow. She jogged alongside, still clutching his hand, until they reached a set of double doors marked Trauma. "I'm sorry, Ma'am, but you'll need to wait here," a nurse said gently but firmly, blocking Clara's path as they prepared to take Ethan through the doors. "The doctors need to assess your husband's injuries. Someone will come speak with you as soon as possible." Clara reluctantly released Ethan's hand, watching helplessly as he disappeared beyond the swinging doors. She stood frozen in the hallway, suddenly at a loss. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the bear attack, the agonizing wait for rescue, and the helicopter flight was finally wearing off completely, leaving her exhausted and disoriented. "Mrs. Reed?" A different nurse approached, her expression kind. "Why don't you come with me? We'll get you settled in the waiting area, and I can take some information for your husband's admission." Clara nodded mutely and allowed herself to be led to a small but comfortable waiting room. She sank into a chair, only now realizing how filthy and disheveled she must look, her clothes torn and stained with Ethan's blood, her hair tangled from the helicopter's downdraft, her face streaked with dirt and tears. The nurse seemed to read her thoughts. "Would you like to clean up a bit? We have a family bathroom just down the hall with some basic toiletries." "Yes, please," Clara said, her voice hoarse from stress and dehydration. "And I don't suppose you have any clothes I could borrow? Everything we had was destroyed by the bear." The nurse nodded understandingly. "We keep some scrubs and basic necessities for situations like this. I'll find you something to wear and bring it to the bathroom." True to her word, by the time Clara had washed her face and hands, the nurse had left a set of blue scrubs, a packet containing a toothbrush, toothpaste and deodorant, and even a pair of hospital socks with non-slip bottoms outside the door. The simple act of cleaning up and changing into fresh clothes lifted Clara's spirits marginally. When she returned to the waiting room, the nurse was ready with a clipboard of forms requiring Ethan's personal information, insurance details, and a brief description of how his injuries had occurred. "Bear attack," Clara wrote in the space. "I provided," the stark words failing utterly to capture the terror and chaos of the experience. As she filled out the forms, another thought struck her. "I should call someone," she realized aloud. "Our parents will be worried when they can't reach us." The nurse provided a hospital phone, and Clara first called Ethan's parents in Denver, then her own in Seattle. Both conversations followed a similar pattern. Initial expressions of shock and alarm, followed by tearful relief that both Clara and Ethan had survived, and immediate promises to book flights to Jackson Hole. "Don't rush," Clara found herself saying, though she desperately wanted the comfort of family. "Ethan's in good hands and they say he should recover well. Maybe wait until we know more about his condition." But both sets of parents were adamant. They would be there by evening no matter what. After the calls were completed, Clara settled back to wait for news of Ethan. The minutes dragged into hours, punctuated only by occasional updates from nursing staff. Ethan was still being assessed. The surgical team had been assembled. Preparations for surgery were underway. Finally, nearly 3 hours after their arrival at the hospital, a doctor in surgical scrubs appeared in the waiting room doorway. "Mrs. Reed?" he inquired, scanning the small room. Clara shot to her feet. "Yes, that's me. How is Ethan?" The surgeon, Dr. Collins, according to his ID badge, gestured for her to sit back down, taking the chair beside her. "Your husband is stable and being prepared for surgery," he began, his tone professional but compassionate. "I've examined his injuries thoroughly, and while they are serious, I believe we can expect a good outcome." Clara closed her eyes briefly in relief. "Thank you," she breathed. Dr. Collins nodded, then continued with his assessment. "Ethan has sustained 3 deep lacerations across his upper back, caused by the bear's claws. The wounds extend through the skin and subcutaneous tissue into the underlying muscle structures. There is significant damage to the trapezius and latissimus dorsi muscles, particularly on the right side." He paused, ensuring Clara was following his explanation. "The good news is that there appears to be no damage to the spine itself, nor to any major blood vessels. Had the claws struck just a few inches lower, or with greater force, the outcome could have been much more severe." Clara shuddered at the implication. "So what happens now?" "We'll take him to surgery within the hour," Dr. Collins explained. "The procedure will involve thoroughly cleaning the wounds to prevent infection. Bear claws can introduce numerous bacteria, followed by careful repair of the damaged muscle tissue and closure of the lacerations." "How long will the surgery take?" "Approximately 3 to 4 hours, depending on what we find once we begin. Bear attack injuries can be complex, with damage not always apparent from initial examination." Clara nodded, trying to process all the information. "And after surgery, what kind of recovery are we looking at?" The surgeon's expression grew more measured. "Recovery will be gradual. Initially, Ethan will need to limit movement to allow the repaired tissues to heal. Physical therapy will be essential to restore full function to the affected muscle groups. Most patients with similar injuries achieve excellent functional outcomes, though some limitation in range of motion is possible." "And scarring?" Clara asked, thinking of the angry red marks that must now mar Ethan's back. "There will be scarring," Dr. Collins acknowledged. "We'll do our best to minimize it through careful surgical technique, but given the nature and extent of the lacerations, some scarring is inevitable. Modern scar management techniques can help improve the appearance over time." Clara absorbed this information, trying to focus on the positives. Ethan was alive, would recover, would still be able to do most, if not all, of the activities he loved. Scars were a small price to pay for survival. "When can I see him?" she asked. "You can see him briefly before surgery, then again in the recovery room afterward," Dr. Collins replied, rising to his feet. "I'll have a nurse come get you when he's ready." True to the surgeon's word, a nurse arrived about 20 minutes later to escort Clara to the preoperative area. Ethan lay on a gurney, hooked up to IV lines and monitoring equipment, his skin still pale but less alarmingly so than before. "Hey, beautiful," he murmured as Clara approached, echoing his greeting from that morning, a morning that now seemed a lifetime ago. Clara took his hand, careful not to disturb the IV. "Hey yourself, Bear Bait," she replied, managing a wobbly smile. Ethan's lips quirked upward. "Not funny. Not even a little," she agreed, tears threatening again. "But you're going to be okay, that's all that matters." A nurse approached, informing them gently that it was time to take Ethan to the operating room. Clara leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to his lips. "I'll be waiting right here," she promised. "Your parents and mine are flying in tonight." "Great," Ethan groaned theatrically. "Nothing like a bear attack to bring the in-laws together." Clara laughed despite herself, giving his hand one final squeeze before stepping back to allow the nurses to wheel him away. "I love you," she called after him. "Love you more," he replied, his voice fading as the gurney disappeared through the doors to the surgical suite. Left alone once again, Clara returned to the waiting room, settling in for the long hours ahead. The hospital staff kept her supplied with coffee and sandwiches as the afternoon stretched on, the hands of the clock seeming to move with glacial slowness. At some point, a Wyoming Game and Fish Department officer arrived, introducing himself as Ranger Mike Holloway. Tall and weathered, with the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to dealing with both wildlife and humans in crisis, he asked Clara to recount the details of the bear attack. Clara described everything she could remember: the size and appearance of the grizzly, its behavior before and during the attack, the direction it had headed afterward. Ranger Holloway took careful notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "You mentioned the food bag was left in the vestibule overnight," he said, his tone neutral rather than accusatory. "Had you both received information about proper food storage in bear country?" Clara nodded, her cheeks flushing with shame. "Yes, we attended the required briefing when we registered our backcountry camping permit. They emphasized proper food storage multiple times." The ranger nodded, making another note. "Unfortunately, it's a common mistake, especially with experienced hikers who may have grown comfortable in the backcountry. Sometimes it takes an incident like this to reinforce just how important those precautions are. Believe me," Clara said quietly, "we've learned our lesson." "Your campsite location," Ranger Holloway continued, "can you show me on a map?" He produced a detailed topographical map of the Bridger-Teton National Forest, and Clara pointed out the approximate location of their campsite. The ranger marked it with a small X. "We'll be sending a team to the area to retrieve any remaining belongings and properly dispose of the food items," he explained. "We'll also monitor for the bear. If it shows signs of becoming habituated to human food or aggressive behavior, we may need to take further action." Clara's brow furrowed with concern. "You mean euthanize it?" The ranger's expression remained carefully neutral. "That's always a last resort, but it is sometimes necessary for public safety, particularly if a bear begins associating humans with food." An unexpected wave of emotion swept over Clara, not just for Ethan and their ruined honeymoon, but for the bear itself, an animal simply following its instincts in an environment increasingly encroached upon by humans. "It was just doing what bears do," she said softly. "We were the ones who made the mistake." Ranger Holloway's expression softened slightly. "That's a remarkably compassionate perspective, given what you and your husband have been through today." He closed his notebook and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "I'll need an official statement from both of you eventually, but that can wait until your husband is recovered enough to participate." He handed Clara his card before departing, urging her to contact him if she remembered any additional details about the encounter or had questions about the incident report. Shortly after the ranger left, both sets of parents arrived within an hour of each other. Ethan's parents, Robert and Linda Reed, followed by Clara's, Michael and Susan Chen. The waiting room filled with tearful embraces, expressions of relief and concern, and a flurry of practical questions about Ethan's condition and what the families could do to help. "We've already booked a hotel suite," Linda Reed announced, her organizational skills kicking in despite her obvious distress over her son's injuries. "There's room for all of us, including you and Ethan, once he's discharged. And we've picked up some clothes and toiletries for both of you," Susan Chen added, handing Clara a shopping bag from a local department store. "Just basics for now, but enough to get you through the next few days." Clara was overwhelmed with gratitude for these small but essential kindnesses. The presence of family made the sterile hospital waiting room feel less lonely, the weight of the day's events slightly more bearable. Finally, nearly 4 hours after Ethan had been wheeled into surgery, Dr. Collins returned, still in his surgical scrubs but with his mask removed. The 4 parents immediately surrounded Clara as the surgeon approached. "The surgery went well, Dr." Collins announced without preamble, understanding their anxiety. "We were able to thoroughly clean the wounds and repair the damaged muscle tissue. There were no unexpected complications, and Ethan tolerated the procedure well." Collective sighs of relief filled the small waiting room. Clara felt her knees weaken slightly, and her father placed a supportive arm around her shoulders. "He's in the recovery room now," the surgeon continued. "Once he's fully awake and stable, he'll be moved to a private room. One person can visit. Him in recovery." He glanced at Clara. "I assume that would be you, Mrs. Reed?" Clara nodded emphatically. Yes, please. The rest of you can see him once he's settled in his room, though I'd ask that you limit visits to short periods for the first 24 hours. He'll need considerable rest. The surgeon provided additional details about Ethan's immediate post-operative care and the recovery process ahead. He would likely remain in the hospital for 3 to 5 days, depending on how well he healed initially. After discharge, he would need follow-up appointments to monitor the wounds, remove sutures, and begin the physical therapy process. Can we take him home to Denver? Robert Reed asked, ever practical. Or does he need to stay in Jackson Hole for follow-up care? Once he's stable enough for discharge, he can return to Denver, Dr. Collins confirmed. I can recommend colleagues there who specialize in trauma recovery and physical rehabilitation. However, air travel isn't advisable for at least 2 weeks, so you'd need to arrange ground transportation. With the most pressing concerns addressed, a nurse arrived to escort Clara to the recovery room where Ethan was beginning to wake from anesthesia. She found him groggy and disoriented, positioned carefully on his side to avoid pressure on his injured back. Clara, he mumbled as she took his hand, his eyes struggling to focus on her face. I'm right here, she assured him, stroking his hair back from his forehead. The surgery went well, you're going to be fine. Ethan's eyes drifted closed again, but he maintained his grip on her hand. The bear? He asked, his voice slurred from the lingering effects of anesthesia. Long gone, Clara told him. We're safe now. Our parents are here, waiting to see you once you're moved to a room. A faint smile touched Ethan's lips before he drifted back into sleep. Clara remained beside him, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, marveling at the resilience of the human body and spirit. By evening, Ethan had been transferred to a private room on the surgical floor. Though still heavily medicated for pain, he was more alert, able to briefly greet his parents and in-laws before fatigue overtook him again. The families took turns, sitting with him through the night, though Clara refused to leave his side, except for brief restroom breaks. She dozed fitfully in a reclining chair beside his bed, waking at each sound from the monitoring equipment or whenever a nurse entered to check Ethan's vital signs. Morning brought improved clarity for Ethan and a visit from Dr. Collins to examine the surgical site. Clara watched anxiously as the surgeon carefully removed the outer bandages, revealing the extent of the damage for the first time. 3 parallel lacerations traversed Ethan's upper back diagonally, from his right shoulder blade to just above his left kidney. The wounds had been meticulously closed with layers of sutures, but even with the skilled surgical repair, it was clear that the scars would be significant, permanent reminders of their encounter with the wilderness at its most raw and unforgiving. The tissue looks good, Dr. Collins commented, gently probing the areas around the suture lines. No signs of infection so far, though we'll continue IV antibiotics as a precaution. Bear claws can introduce numerous bacteria, including some unusual strains. Over the next few days, Ethan's recovery progressed steadily. The pain gradually became more manageable, allowing him to reduce his reliance on the stronger medications. Physical therapists visited daily, demonstrating gentle exercises he could perform even while still hospitalized to maintain mobility without stressing the healing tissues. Throughout it all, Clara remained by his side, sleeping in the hospital room despite her mother's protests that she should come to the hotel for proper rest. The bond between the newlyweds seemed to have deepened through their shared trauma, their easy banter and quiet moments of connection, a testament to the strength of their relationship. On the 4th day after the surgery, Dr. Collins deemed Ethan stable enough for discharge. A final battery of tests confirmed that the wounds were healing well, with no signs of infection or complications. You're not out of the woods yet, the surgeon cautioned during his final visit, ironically evoking the very environment that had nearly claimed Ethan's life. Complete recovery will take months, not days. The sutures will remain in place for at least 2 weeks, and you'll need to avoid any strenuous activity that could stress the repair sites. Ethan nodded solemnly from his seated position on the edge of the hospital bed, now dressed in the casual clothes his parents had purchased rather than the standard hospital gown. Physical therapy will be essential, Dr. Collins continued. I'm providing referrals to specialists in Denver who can continue your rehabilitation once you're back home. Don't skip appointments, even when you start feeling better. The work you do in the first few months will determine how much function you ultimately regain. I'll make sure he follows every instruction, Clara promised, her expression leaving no doubt as to her determination. The surgeon smiled slightly. "I believe you will." He turned back to Ethan. "As for travel, I'd recommend waiting at least a week before attempting the drive back to Colorado. Your parents mentioned they've extended the hotel reservation?" Robert Reed nodded from his position near the door. "We've got the suite for another 10 days if needed." "Perfect," Dr. Collins. "Approved. Use that time to rest and begin the initial therapy sessions here. If all goes well, you should be comfortable enough for car travel by next weekend." With final instructions provided and prescriptions for pain management and antibiotics in hand, Ethan was officially discharged from St. John's Medical Center. A wheelchair was required hospital policy for exiting the building, though Ethan grumbled good-naturedly about the indignity. "I can walk just fine," he protested, as an orderly helped him into the chair. "Hospital rules," Clara reminded him, following behind with a small bag of belongings, mostly items purchased by their parents, since everything they had brought on their honeymoon had been destroyed in the bear attack. As they emerged from the hospital's main entrance into the bright Wyoming sunshine, Ethan squinted upward at the clear blue sky, seeming to savor the fresh air after days in the sterile hospital environment. "Freedom," he declared with a grin. Clara squeezed his shoulder gently, careful to avoid the bandaged areas. "Don't get too excited. You're just trading one form of confinement for another. Hotel suite instead of hospital room. Still progress," Ethan insisted, as Robert pulled their rented SUV up to the curb. The hotel suite proved to be spacious and comfortable, with 2 bedrooms, a small kitchenette and a living area with ample seating for the extended family. Located near the town square in Jackson, it offered views of the surrounding mountains and easy access to the amenities of the tourist-friendly town. Over the next week, a routine developed. Mornings were devoted to Ethan's physical therapy appointments, where he worked with specialists to maintain mobility in his shoulders and back, without placing undue stress on the healing wounds. Afternoons were spent resting in the hotel suite, often with one or both sets of parents, taking the opportunity to explore Jackson while Clara remained with Ethan. Evenings brought the families together for meals, sometimes prepared in the suite's kitchenette, other times enjoyed at local restaurants that accommodated Ethan's need for careful seating arrangements to avoid pressure on his back. Throughout it all, Ethan maintained his characteristically positive attitude, joking about their extended honeymoon and entertaining their parents with increasingly embellished accounts of their bear encounter. "You should have seen Clara," he would say, his eyes shining with genuine admiration. Cool as ice, even with a 1,000-pound killing machine 10 feet away. Clara would roll her eyes at the exaggeration. The grizzly, while imposing, had certainly not weighed 1,000 pounds, but she never corrected the pride in his voice when he described her actions during the crisis. On their 6th day in Jackson, Ranger Holloway visited the hotel suite to take their official statements about the incident. He arrived in his Wyoming Game and Fish Department uniform, clipboard in hand, his manner professional but sympathetic. "How's the recovery coming along?" he asked Ethan after the initial introductions. "Better every day," Ethan replied, shifting carefully in his seat to find a comfortable position. "Still a long road ahead, but the doctors say I should eventually regain full function." The ranger nodded, seeming pleased by the news. "Glad to hear it. I've seen far worse outcomes from grizzly encounters." He proceeded to interview them both, starting with Clara's perspective on the events leading up to the attack, then moving to Ethan's account. Both were candid about the mistake that had precipitated the incident, the food bag left in the tent vestibule overnight, rather than properly stored away from their campsite. "We knew better," Ethan admitted, his expression solemn. "I've been backpacking since I was a teenager, taken all the wilderness safety courses. It was just convenience. Laziness, really. Didn't want to go back out in the rain." Ranger Holloway nodded without judgment. "It's a common mistake, unfortunately. Even experienced backcountry users get complacent sometimes." "Has there been any sign of the bear since?" Clara asked, thinking back to their conversation in the hospital about potential monitoring or even euthanasia of the animal. "We sent a team to your campsite the day after the attack," the ranger explained. "They secured the remaining food items and packed out the damaged equipment. Trail cameras were set up in the area to monitor for the bear's return." He flipped through some papers on his clipboard, based on your descriptions and the evidence. "At the scene, we've identified the bear as a male grizzly, approximately 8 years old. that's been tagged in previous population studies. He's known to range throughout that section of the Bridger Teton, but hasn't been involved in human conflicts before this incident. So what happens to him now? Ethan asked. We're maintaining the trail cameras and increasing ranger patrols in the area, Holloway replied. Since this appears to be a food-motivated incident rather than predatory behavior, and it's the bear's first known human interaction, the current protocol doesn't call for removal or euthanasia. Clara felt a surprising surge of relief at this news. Despite the trauma they had experienced, she had found herself concerned about the bear's fate, recognizing that the animal had simply been following its instincts, drawn by human error rather than inherent aggression. However, the ranger continued, his expression growing more serious, we have temporarily closed several backcountry campsites in that area as a precaution, and we've posted warnings at trailheads about increased bear activity. He completed his interview, having Clara and Ethan each sign their statements, then handed them a copy of the official incident report for their records. This will be filed with both Wyoming Game and Fish and the National Park Service, explained. If you need additional copies for insurance purposes or medical records, you can request them through our office. As he prepared to leave, the ranger reached into his pocket and produced a small pamphlet. We've developed this educational material about bear safety in the backcountry. Would you be willing to review it and provide feedback? Your recent experience makes your perspective particularly valuable. Of course, Clara agreed, taking the pamphlet. We'd be happy to. After the ranger's departure, Ethan examined the incident report more closely, his expression growing thoughtful. What is it? Clara asked, noticing his furrowed brow. Just thinking, he replied slowly, about how fast it all happened, how differently it could have ended. He looked up, meeting her gaze. We were lucky, Clara, really lucky. She nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The attack had lasted mere seconds, but those seconds could easily have resulted in fatal injuries had the bear's claws struck just a few inches differently, or had the bear spray failed to deter the animal from continuing its assault. I keep thinking about what we could do to help prevent this from happening to someone else, Ethan continued. Our gear was destroyed anyway. What if we donated the insurance money to a bear awareness program instead of replacing everything? Clara smiled, reaching for his hand. I think that's a wonderful idea. The following day, they contacted their insurance company, initiating the claim process for their lost camping equipment. While the representative was sympathetic about their experience, he was also clear about the limitations of their coverage. Your homeowner's policy covers personal property even while traveling, he explained, but there may be specific exclusions or limitations for certain types of losses, particularly those occurring in high-risk activities or environments. After reviewing their policy details, he confirmed that they would receive compensation for most of their destroyed gear, though not the full replacement value. The claim would take several weeks to process completely, requiring documentation of the incident, which they now had in the form of the ranger's official report, and receipts or other proof of ownership for the lost items. With that process underway, Clara researched bear conservation and education organizations, eventually discovering a non-profit based in Bozeman, Montana, that specialized in promoting coexistence between humans and grizzly bears through education, proper food storage infrastructure, and research. They have a program that provides bear-resistant food canisters to backcountry users, she told Ethan excitedly, and they do educational outreach in schools about bear safety. I think they'd be perfect. Ethan agreed, and they made arrangements to donate the majority of their insurance settlement to the organization once it was processed. They also offered to share their story for the group's educational materials, providing a first-hand account of how quickly a simple mistake could lead to a dangerous wildlife encounter. As the week progressed, Ethan's recovery continued steadily. By the 8th day after his discharge from the hospital, Dr. Collins cleared him for the journey back to Denver, with specific instructions for comfortable travel arrangements. Frequent stops to stretch and change positions, the surgeon emphasized during Ethan's final checkup in Jackson. The drive to Denver is 8 hours? I'd recommend breaking it into 2 days if possible. Their parents had already arranged for this, booking accommodations in Rawlins, Wyoming, roughly halfway between Jackson and Denver, for an overnight stay during the journey. The night before their departure, as Clara and Ethan prepared for bed in their hotel suite, Ethan noticed her standing by the window, gazing out at the silhouette of the Teton Range against the night sky. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, carefully settling himself on the edge of the bed. Clara turned to him, her expression pensive. "I was just thinking about our honeymoon, not exactly what we planned, was it?" Ethan chuckled softly. "Not even close, though I did promise you an adventure." "That you did." She moved to sit beside him, taking his hand in hers. "I was also thinking about what we'll tell people when we get home, about the bear, about what happened. We tell them the truth," Ethan said simply, "that we made a rookie mistake in bear country and learned a painful but important lesson, that we're incredibly lucky to be alive, that my wife is the bravest, coolest-headed person I've ever known." Clara smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And we show them our scars, yours on your back, mine invisible but just as real, marking us forever as survivors," Ethan murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "A wild start to our marriage, but we got through it together. If we can handle a grizzly bear on our honeymoon, I think we can probably handle anything life throws at us." Clara nodded against his shoulder, finding comfort in the thought. Their story would always be unusual. Not many couples could claim a bear attack as part of their honeymoon experience, but it was theirs, with all its terror and pain and ultimate triumph. The journey back to Denver unfolded as planned. With Robert and Linda Reed driving the SUV, Ethan reclined in the back seat with pillows carefully positioned to minimize pressure on his healing wounds, and Clara beside him, attentive to his comfort throughout the long hours on the road. They spent the night in Rawlins as scheduled, continuing to Denver the following day. Clara's parents had flown ahead to prepare Ethan and Clara's apartment, ensuring everything was ready for Ethan's continued recovery at home. Arriving at their small but comfortable apartment in Denver's Washington Park neighborhood was a watershed moment, the first time they had truly been home since the wedding and subsequent honeymoon. The familiar surroundings brought a sense of normalcy that had been lacking during the chaotic days following the attack. Susan Chen had stocked their refrigerator with prepared meals, arranged for a cleaning service, and even set up a makeshift bedroom in their living room so Ethan could avoid climbing the stairs to their second-floor bedroom until his back had healed further. The parents stayed for 2 more days, helping the newlyweds settle into a routine that accommodated Ethan's limited mobility and ongoing recovery needs. When they finally departed, the Reeds back to their home in Denver's suburbs, the Chens to the airport for their flight to Seattle, Clara found herself simultaneously relieved to have their space back and apprehensive about managing Ethan's care alone. "We'll be fine," Ethan assured her, sensing her anxiety as they waved goodbye to their parents. "I'm getting stronger every day, and you've become quite the nurse." Clara smiled, though the weight of responsibility still sat heavily on her shoulders. "Just promise you'll tell me if you need anything. No trying to be a hero, I think." "I've filled my heroism quota for the year," Ethan replied dryly. "Besides, you're the real hero in this story. I just got mauled. You saved both our lives." In the weeks that followed, they established a new normal. Ethan began outpatient physical therapy at a sports medicine clinic recommended by Dr. Collins's Denver colleagues. 3 times a week, he worked with specialists to gradually rebuild strength and flexibility in his damaged back muscles, coming home exhausted but satisfied with his progress. Clara had contacted her employer, an environmental consulting firm where she worked as a project manager, and arranged for extended remote work to accommodate Ethan's recovery needs. Her supervisors and colleagues had been unanimously supportive upon learning of their ordeal, sending flowers, prepared meals, and offers of assistance. Ethan, meanwhile, faced a longer absence from his job as a high school biology teacher. The school year had just ended before their wedding, but he would need medical clearance before returning for the fall semester. The school administration assured him his position was secure, encouraging him to focus solely on recovery. 2 weeks. After their return to Denver, Ethan had his sutures removed by his new local surgeon. The procedure was uncomfortable but quick, revealing the healing wounds beneath. "The incisions are closing nicely," the surgeon commented as she examined Ethan's back. "No signs of infection or complications. You're healing well." Clara, who had accompanied Ethan to the appointment, peered over the doctor's shoulder at the revealed scars. 3 parallel lines, raised and red against Ethan's skin, running diagonally across his upper back. "Will they always be so prominent?" she asked hesitantly. The surgeon nodded frankly. They will fade somewhat with time, becoming less red and raised. But yes, these will be permanent, visible scars. Bear claws cause significant tissue damage that can't heal without leaving marks. Rather than being discouraged by this news, Ethan seemed to accept it with surprising equanimity. "Battle scars," he said later, as they drove home from the appointment. "Reminders that we faced something wild and survived." As the summer progressed, their days fell into a rhythm dictated by Ethan's recovery. Morning physical therapy sessions, afternoon rest periods, evening walks that gradually increased in length as his strength returned. They reconnected with friends, sharing abbreviated versions of their experience, finding that most people's reactions ranged from horrified fascination to profound relief at their survival. No one, it seemed, quite knew how to respond to their story. It was too dramatic, too far outside the normal honeymoon experience of beach resorts and European tours. Some friends seemed almost disappointed when Ethan and Clara downplayed the drama, emphasizing instead the mundane aspects of recovery and the importance of proper food storage in bear country. "People want the sensational version," Ethan observed after one such gathering. "The hero tale, not the cautionary one." Clara nodded, understanding. "It's easier to think of it as a freak occurrence than to acknowledge it could happen to anyone who makes the same mistake we did." In July, nearly 6 weeks after the attack, they received notification that their insurance claim had been processed. The settlement amount was less than full replacement value for their destroyed equipment, as expected, but still substantial, nearly $3,000. True to their decision, they donated the majority of the money to the Bear Conservation Organization Clara had researched in Jackson, designating it specifically for their educational outreach programs. The organization responded with gratitude and an invitation to share their story at an upcoming workshop for backcountry guides and outdoor educators. "I think we should do it," Clara said after they received the invitation. "It would be a way to turn our experience into something positive, something that might prevent someone else from making the same mistake." Ethan agreed, and in late July they traveled to Bozeman for the workshop. Standing before a room of experienced outdoor professionals, they recounted their story without embellishment or drama, simply the facts of what had happened, what they had learned, and how it had changed their perspective on wilderness and their place within it. "We thought we knew enough," Ethan told the attentive audience. "We'd taken the courses, read the books, received the warnings. But in that moment, convenience won out over caution. It was a decision that nearly cost us our lives." The response was overwhelmingly positive, with many participants expressing appreciation for their candor and willingness to acknowledge their mistake. The organization's director asked if they would be willing to record a version of their presentation for use in their broader educational materials, an opportunity they readily accepted. By August, Ethan's physical recovery had progressed remarkably. Though he still experienced occasional pain and stiffness, particularly during changes in weather, he had regained most of his range of motion and was gradually returning to more strenuous activities under his physical therapist's guidance. The emotional recovery, however, proved more complex for both of them. Clara found herself startled by unexpected noises, particularly in the early morning hours that echoed the timing of the attack. Ethan experienced occasional nightmares, waking disoriented and reaching instinctively for the bear spray that was no longer beside their bed. "Maybe we should talk to someone," Clara suggested after one such night, holding Ethan as his breathing gradually steadied. "A professional, I mean. About the anxiety, the flashbacks." Ethan nodded against her shoulder. "Probably not a bad idea. PTSD isn't just for combat veterans." They found a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery, beginning separate and occasionally joint sessions to process their experience. The therapist helped them understand that their reactions were normal, expected responses to the life-threatening situation they had faced. "Your bodies and minds are still processing what happened," she explained during an early session. "The hypervigilance, the startle response, the flashbacks, these are all ways your brain is trying to protect you from future threats." With her guidance, they developed strategies for managing these responses, grounding techniques for moments of panic, communication approaches for supporting each other through difficult days, mindfulness practices to stay connected to the present rather than being pulled back into the trauma of the past. As the fall approached and Ethan prepared to return to teaching, they made one more significant decision. The honeymoon they had, planned and lost, had been their only vacation time for the year, a special trip they had saved for and anticipated for months. The bear attack had transformed it from a celebration into a nightmare. "I think we need a do-over," Ethan suggested one evening as they sat on their small balcony, watching the sunset over the Denver skyline. "Not a replacement for what happened, that will always be part of our story, but a new beginning, a second honeymoon." Clara smiled, intrigued by the idea. "What did you have in mind?" "Something completely different," Ethan replied thoughtfully. "No camping, no wilderness, no possibility of large predators. Maybe a weekend at a nice hotel in Aspen, just us, room service, hot tubs, and absolutely no bears." The suggestion made Clara laugh, the sound light and genuine in a way that had become more frequent as the summer progressed. "I love it. A bear-free honeymoon take two." They booked the trip for the Labor Day weekend, just before Ethan would return to teaching, and Clara would resume her normal office schedule. The small luxury hotel in Aspen proved the perfect antidote to their wilderness misadventure, comfortable, safe, and blissfully free of any wildlife larger than the occasional squirrel. On their second evening there, as they relaxed in the hotel's rooftop hot tub with glasses of champagne, Ethan grew unusually contemplative. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked, noticing his distant expression. "The bear, actually," he admitted. "I was wondering where it is now, what it's doing." Clara considered this, surprising herself with her own lack of fear or resentment at the thought of the animal that had so dramatically altered their lives. "Probably getting ready for winter," she mused, "eating as much as possible before hibernation." "Just being a bear," Ethan agreed, his expression clearing. "Doing exactly what bears are supposed to do. And we're doing exactly what humans are supposed to do," Clara added, raising her champagne glass. "Learning from our mistakes, adapting, moving forward." Ethan clinked his glass against hers. "To adaptation and moving forward, and to our wild beginning." As summer gave way to fall, Ethan returned to his classroom with a new perspective on the biology he taught. His students were initially fascinated by his scars and the story behind them, but their interest eventually shifted to the ecological insights his experience had provided, the delicate balance between humans and wildlife, the responsibilities that came with entering wilderness areas, the consequences of carelessness in natural spaces. Clara, too, found that her work in environmental consulting had taken on new dimensions. Her first-hand experience with wildlife conflict gave her a unique perspective in projects involving human-wildlife interaction zones, land use planning, and public education initiatives. The physical reminders of their encounter remained. Ethan's scars, though fading from angry red to silvery white, were permanent features across his back. During their regular physical activities, hiking the foothills near Denver, weekend bike rides, the occasional climbing gym session, he sometimes experienced twinges of pain or limitations in certain movements, subtle but persistent reminders of that morning in Wyoming. But the most enduring impact was invisible, a profound appreciation for the wild places they still loved to visit, now tempered with deeper respect for the powerful forces at work there. They returned to backpacking the following summer, but with meticulously observed safety protocols, redundant bear-resistant food storage systems, and a heightened awareness of their surroundings that enhanced rather than diminished their wilderness experience. In their living room, a framed photograph held a place of honor, not of the bear attack itself, which had gone undocumented except in their memories and Ethan's scars, but of the two of them standing before the Grand Tetons a day before the attack, their faces alight, with joy and anticipation, blissfully unaware of what the wilderness had in store. Beside it sat a small, carefully preserved fragment of their shredded tent, framed like a precious artifact. Visitors often asked about this unusual display, prompting Ethan and Clara to share their story once again, not as a tale of terror, but as one of resilience, respect, and ultimately a wild love that had faced nature's power and emerged stronger for the experience. In the forests of Wyoming, the grizzly that had forever altered their lives continued its solitary existence, roaming the vast wilderness according to patterns established over millennia of evolution, occasionally crossing paths with humans, but more often moving unseen, through landscapes where both species were merely temporary visitors in an ancient and enduring natural world. Now let's move on to the story of the next survivor. Greg Talbot stood knee-deep in the cold, clear waters of the Hoh River, his fly rod gracefully arcing through the misty morning air. The Olympic Peninsula stretched around him, in a verdant cathedral of moss-draped spruce and towering Douglas firs. At 53, Greg had been fly fishing for nearly 4 decades, but the pristine waters of Washington's rainforest rivers remained his favorite retreat from the accounting firm he'd built in Seattle. The rhythmic casting, the rushing water, and the isolation were his therapy, a perfect antidote to spreadsheets, client meetings, and the perpetual drizzle of urban life. He had arrived at his cabin the previous evening, driving the familiar route from Seattle to Port Angeles, then south into the heart of the Olympic National Park. The small A-frame he'd purchased 15 years ago sat a quarter-mile from the high, nearest neighbor, nestled among western hemlocks with a partial view of the river. Greg had planned this 3-day weekend for months, watching weather patterns and salmon run reports, with the dedication of a man plotting an expedition. His wife, Diane, had long ago accepted these solo pilgrimages as necessary for her husband's well-being, though she preferred the comforts of their Ballard neighborhood to the rustic simplicity of the cabin. "Just don't forget your satellite phone this time," she'd reminded him as he loaded his Subaru Outback. "And check in tonight, okay? Not like last April when I didn't hear from you for 2 days." Greg had smiled and kissed her forehead. "Promise. I've got everything charged up, and I'm only going to spots with decent reception." That had been partially true. The Hoh River Trail had spotty coverage at best, but Greg knew a few reliable locations where he could make his obligatory safety calls. Besides, this particular stretch of river about 4 miles from the Hoh Rainforest Visitor Center was one he'd fished dozens of times without incident. September was his favorite month here. Summer tourists had thinned out, fall colors were beginning to emerge, and the coho salmon were starting their run up river to spawn. Now, as morning mist rose from the water's surface, Greg meticulously selected a fly from his vest, a pink and purple starlight leech pattern he'd tied himself last winter. The early light filtered through the ancient trees, casting dappled shadows across the river. He'd been on the water since dawn, working methodically upstream, savoring each cast and the possibility held in each drift of his fly. 3 hours in, Greg had caught and released 2 modest trout, but he knew the deeper pools ahead held promise of larger prizes. Wading carefully on the slick riverbed stones, he progressed around a gentle bend where the river widened slightly before narrowing again through a channel of larger boulders. The spot was perfect, the current creating a seam where fish would hold, waiting for food to drift by. Had he not been so focused on his presentation, Greg might have noticed the signs earlier: the partially eaten salmon carcass on the far bank, the fresh claw marks on a riverside tree, the unusual silence in the forest, absent of the typical squirrel chatter and bird calls. But the zone of concentration that made Greg an excellent accountant and a dedicated angler also narrowed his awareness, a tunnel vision that excluded peripheral warnings. He cast toward the seam in the current, his line unfurling perfectly. The weighted fly sank quickly, drifting naturally along the bottom contours. Greg mended his line, adjusting the drift, when a flash of movement on the far bank caught his attention. He glanced up, squinting against the dappled sunlight now breaking through the morning mist. The black bear was not particularly large by Olympic Peninsula standards, perhaps a 3-year-old male weighing around 200 pounds, but its sudden appearance sent a jolt through Greg's system. The bear stood partially submerged at the river's edge about 30 yards upstream, its head lowered as it scanned the water for salmon. Greg froze, his heart pounding in his chest. In all his years fishing these waters, he'd spotted bears occasionally, but always at a comfortable distance. The proper protocol ran through his mind: stay calm, make noise to avoid startling the animal, back away slowly, avoid eye contact, but keep the bear in view. He'd attended enough ranger talks and read enough wilderness safety pamphlets to know the drill. Black bears rarely attacked humans unless provoked or startled. Greg began to reel in his line slowly, planning his careful retreat downstream. But as the line tightened, his fly snagged on something underwater, a submerged branch or rock that held fast despite his gentle tugs. "Damn it," he muttered, his voice barely audible above the river's constant flow. The bear's head snapped up, ears forward, dark eyes focusing directly on Greg. For a moment, they regarded each other across the water, human and animal linked in mutual assessment. Greg remained motionless, his fly rod still raised, line taut to the underwater snag. The bear huffed once, a deep exhalation visible in the cool morning air. Then, without warning, it plunged into the deeper water, swimming with surprising speed directly toward Greg. "Hey, hey!" Greg shouted, suddenly remembering the advice to make himself loud and large. He raised his arms, still clutching the fly rod, and continued shouting, "Get out of here! Go on!" The bear paused briefly, treading water, seemingly reconsidering its approach. For a moment, Greg thought the noise had worked. Then he realized his mistake. Upstream, just beyond where his fly had snagged, lay the partially submerged body of a large salmon, the clear object of the bear's interest. Greg had inadvertently positioned himself between a predator and its meal. The bear resumed swimming, more determined now. Greg abandoned his fly rod, letting it fall into the water as he turned to wade toward the nearest bank. His waders, essential for the cold September water, now hindered his movement. Each step required fighting both the current and the heavy neoprene clinging to his legs. He was only 10 yards from the bank when he heard the splash behind him, the sound of the bear finding its footing in the shallowing water. Greg risked a glance over his shoulder and saw the animal advancing rapidly, water streaming from its black fur. Fear surged through him, adrenaline flooding his system. He abandoned any pretense of a careful retreat and lunged toward shore, stumbling on the uneven riverbed. The impact came from behind, a freight train of muscle and wet fur that drove Greg face first into the water. The cold shock of complete immersion momentarily overrode the pain of the collision. Instinctively, he fought to regain his footing, to find air. The bear's weight shifted off him almost immediately, not a prolonged attack, but a powerful check, like a linebacker clearing an obstacle. Greg surfaced, gasping, water streaming from his face. He was on his hands and knees in the shallows, just 2 yards from dry land. The bear stood nearby, its attention already diverted to the salmon upstream, apparently satisfied that the human interloper had been displaced. Relief washed over Greg as he scrambled onto the rocky bank, putting distance between himself and the water's edge. He coughed, expelling river water, and took inventory, soaked completely, a few scrapes on his palms from the rocky riverbed, but otherwise intact. "Jesus Christ!" he wheezed, watching as the bear returned its attention to the river, methodically patrolling the shallows for its salmon prize. The animal seemed to have already dismissed Greg as irrelevant, neither threat nor competition. Greg retreated further up the bank, finding a large fallen log where he sat, heart still pounding in his ears. His fly rod was gone, probably drifting downstream by now. His vest was soaked but still contained his car keys, wallet, and most importantly, the satellite phone. "Diane is going to lose her mind," he muttered, imagining his wife's reaction to this story. As his breathing steadied, Greg noticed a sharp pain in his left ankle. He removed his water-filled wader boot and rolled up the neoprene, revealing an arc of puncture marks along his ankle and lower calf, teeth marks, already bruising dramatically against his pale skin. The bear must have clamped down briefly during their chaotic encounter, though in the moment, Greg hadn't even registered the bite through the shock and adrenaline. The wounds weren't deep. The waders had provided some protection, but they were definitely concerning. Any wild animal bite required medical attention, and bear bites carried particular risk of infection. Looking more closely, Greg noticed that one of the punctures appeared deeper than the others, and a steady trickle of blood had begun to soak into his wet sock. "Shit," he muttered, quickly retrieving a small first aid kit from his vest pocket. The waterproof container had survived intact, and he pulled out antiseptic wipes and gauze. The sting of the antiseptic was fierce, but Greg methodically cleaned each puncture before applying pressure with the gauze pad. The bear remained focused on the river, having successfully retrieved the salmon and dragged it to the opposite bank. It now sat hunched over its meal, tearing chunks of pink flesh with impressive efficiency. Greg watched warily as he tended his wound, grateful for the increasing distance between them, but aware of how quickly that could change. Once the bleeding had slowed, Greg wrapped his ankle as best he could with the limited supplies. The pain was intensifying as the adrenaline ebbed, and he suspected there might be damage beyond the punctures, perhaps a small fracture or torn ligament from the force of the bite. Putting weight on it sent shooting pain up his leg. Greg knew he needed to make decisions quickly. The trailhead lay about 4 miles downstream, a challenging hike even without an injury. His cabin was even farther, requiring a drive after reaching his vehicle. The visitor center would have first aid facilities and staff who could help, but that too was miles away. He pulled out the satellite phone, relieved to find it operational despite the dunking. The screen indicated minimal reception. Enough for a text, but probably not a call. Greg composed a message to Diane. Had encounter. With bear. I'm okay, but injured ankle. Heading to visitor center for help. Will call when I can, don't worry. After sending the text, he checked the time. 10:17 a.m. If he started immediately, moving carefully but steadily, he could reach the trailhead by early afternoon. The alternative, waiting for potential help, seemed riskier given the bear's continued presence and the possibility of infection setting in. Greg gathered his remaining gear, leaving the lost fly rod as an acceptable casualty. He fashioned a makeshift walking stick from a sturdy branch, tested his weight distribution, and grimaced at the pain. Manageable, but barely. The hike out would be grueling. With one last glance at the bear, still engrossed in its salmon feast, Greg began his slow journey downstream. The trail occasionally veered away from the riverbank, winding through dense forest before returning to water's edge. He set a methodical pace, using the walking stick to redistribute weight from his injured ankle. An hour into the hike, the pain had evolved from sharp and focused to a broader, deeper throb that encompassed his entire lower leg. Greg paused to check the wound and found the area significantly more swollen, the skin hot to the touch. The initial wrap had loosened, so he reapplied it tighter, hoping to provide more stability. The forest around him teemed with mid-morning activity, birds calling, squirrels chittering, the occasional rustle in the underbrush. Each unexpected sound sent a jolt of hypervigilance through Greg's system, his senses now acutely tuned to potential threats. Though black bear attacks were rare and predatory attacks even rarer, the morning's encounter had shattered his complacency about the wilderness he'd enjoyed for decades. By noon, Greg's progress had slowed considerably, the ankle barely supported, weight now forcing him to hop-step, using the walking stick for balance. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cool September air, the exertion and pain taking their toll. He'd covered perhaps 2 miles, with at least 2 more to go before reaching the trailhead. When the trail dipped closer to the river again, Greg took the opportunity to rest on a fallen log. He drank from his water bottle and checked the satellite phone. No response from Diane yet, but the message showed as delivered. He considered sending an update but decided against it. There was little new information worth sharing, except that his progress was slower than expected. As he sat resting, movement across the river caught his attention. His body tensed automatically, but it wasn't a bear this time, just a family of hikers, a couple with 2 preteen children moving upstream along the opposite bank. They hadn't noticed him yet, focused on their own path and conversation. "Hey!" Greg called, waving his arm. "Over here!" The family stopped, the father shading his eyes to look across the water. "I need some help," Greg continued. "I've injured my ankle, had an encounter with a bear upstream." This information electrified the family, the children's eyes widening as they huddled closer to their parents. After a brief conversation among themselves, the father called back. "We don't have a first aid kit, but we can go get help. We're headed back to the visitor center soon anyway." "That would be great," Greg replied. "My name's Greg Talbot. Tell them I'm making my way to the Hoh River trailhead but moving slowly. Possible. Bear bite and ankle injury." The family promised to relay the message and continued upstream at a quicker pace, the children looking back repeatedly at Greg with a mixture of concern and fascination. Greg felt a surge of relief. Even if he couldn't move any faster, help would likely be on its way soon. With renewed determination, he continued his laborious journey. The trail became more populated as he approached the more accessible sections, and several other hikers passed him, offering concern and assistance. A young couple shared additional bandages from their first aid kit. An older man with a professional-looking camera offered a more stable walking stick, a carved hickory staff he claimed to have used on trails across North America. Greg accepted both gratefully. By mid-afternoon, he spotted a ranger's uniform through the trees, a young woman hiking briskly toward him with a large pack bearing the National Park Service insignia. "Mr. Talbot?" she called, quickening her pace. "I'm Ranger Wilson. Some hikers reported you had a bear encounter." Greg nodded, relief washing over him at the sight of official help. "About 4 miles upstream. Black bear, medium-sized. It was after a salmon and I got in the way, knocked me down in the water and bit my ankle." Ranger Wilson, her nameplate read C. Wilson, guided Greg to a fallen log and knelt to examine his injury. She was perhaps 30, with short brown hair and the weathered complexion of someone who spent most workdays outdoors. "I'm going to remove this wrap and take a look, okay?" she said, already gently unwinding the makeshift bandage. "We've radioed ahead, and there's a medical team waiting at the trailhead. They'll want to clean this properly and assess whether you need hospital transport." The exposure to air renewed the pain in Greg's ankle, and he winced as Ranger Wilson carefully examined the puncture wounds. "Definitely consistent with a black bear bite," she confirmed. "You're lucky the waders absorbed a lot of the force. Without them, these would be much deeper." She pulled fresh gauze and antiseptic from her pack. "I'm going to clean this again and wrap it properly. Then we'll get you to the trailhead. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" As the ranger worked on his ankle, Greg recounted the morning's events: his fishing position, the bear's appearance, the salmon, his attempt to retreat, and the brief but impactful encounter. Ranger Wilson nodded occasionally, asking clarifying questions about the bear's behavior and appearance. "Sounds like a classic case of resource guarding," she said, securing the new bandage. "This time of year they're hyperphagic, eating everything they can to fatten up for winter. A salmon is a high-value meal, and you were between the bear and its food. It wasn't hunting you, it was removing an obstacle." "That's comforting, I guess," Greg replied with a wry smile. "Black bears rarely attack humans predatorily," she continued, helping him to his feet. "They usually just want us out of their way. But this is why we emphasize constant awareness in bear country." She handed him a canteen of fresh water. "Drink this. You're probably dehydrated from the exertion and stress." With Ranger Wilson's support, Greg made better progress along the trail. She carried his pack, allowing him to focus entirely on navigating the terrain with his injury. Along the way, she radioed updates to her colleagues and asked Greg more questions about the bear, its size, specific markings, and exact location. "We'll send a team to the area to assess the situation," she explained. "If it's a bear that's becoming habituated to humans or showing unusual aggression, we might need to intervene. But from what you've described, this sounds like natural behavior in its natural habitat." The trailhead parking lot came into view just before 5 p.m., nearly 7 hours after the bear encounter. A Park Service SUV and a Port Angeles Fire Department medical response vehicle waited near the trail entrance, along with a small cluster of rangers and medical personnel. Events moved quickly from there. The EMTs helped Greg onto a gurney despite his protests that he could walk, conducting a more thorough examination of his injury, while a senior park ranger, a gray-haired man named Hoskins, interviewed him about the encounter. The questions were detailed and specific: time, location, the bear's size, color variations in its fur, ear shape, specific behaviors before, during, and after the contact. "We take every bear encounter seriously," Ranger Hoskins explained, "especially ones involving physical contact. We'll file a full report and monitor the area for a few weeks." The medical assessment concluded that Greg should be transported to Olympic Medical Center in Port Angeles for proper wound treatment and imaging of his ankle. The punctures themselves weren't life-threatening, but the swelling and pain response suggested possible fractures or torn ligaments from the force of the bite. "What about my car?" Greg asked, suddenly remembering practical concerns. "And my cabin, I have things there I need." "We can have your car towed to Port Angeles," Ranger Wilson offered, "and if you give me the cabin address and key, I can swing by later to grab whatever essentials you need." The generosity of the response touched Greg unexpectedly. "That's incredibly kind," he said. "Thank you." As the EMTs prepared to load him into the ambulance, Greg caught sight of a small crowd of hikers and tourists watching from a respectful distance, their expressions ranging from concern to undisguised curiosity. A man with a professional camera took photos until one of the rangers stepped into his line of sight. The spectacle of the situation struck Greg suddenly: how quickly he had transformed from a solitary fisherman to the center of a minor wilderness drama. The ambulance ride to Port Angeles took almost an hour on the winding roads through Olympic National Park. The EMT, monitoring Greg's vital signs, asked about his experience, showing particular interest in the fishing conditions before the bear appeared. "I've been wanting to try fly fishing," the young man confessed. "Been watching videos online, but haven't taken the plunge yet." Greg found himself providing detailed advice about starter equipment and techniques. The conversation, a welcome distraction from his throbbing ankle and the gravity of the morning's events. Talking about fishing, the methodical preparation, the quiet focus, the connection to place, reinforced how deeply he loved the activity, even as he wondered whether today's encounter would change that relationship permanently. Olympic Medical. Santa received him efficiently, whisking him through registration with the help of his still-wet wallet ID and insurance card. X-rays confirmed what the EMTs had suspected. Along with the puncture wounds, Greg had sustained a hairline fracture of the distal fibula, not serious enough to require surgery, but significant enough to necessitate a walking boot and several weeks of limited mobility. "You're lucky," Dr. Mehta told him while examining the images. "Bear bites can crush bones completely. This is more consistent with what we'd see from a fall or twist injury." She pointed to the hairline crack visible on the screen. "The pressure was distributed through your waders and boot, which probably saved you from much worse damage." The treatment protocol was thorough. The wounds were carefully cleaned, debrided, and dressed. Antibiotics were administered intravenously as a precaution against infection. A walking boot was fitted, and prescriptions were written for oral antibiotics and pain management. Throughout the process, different hospital staff members asked about the bear encounter, each seeming more interested than the last in the details of Greg's experience. "You're definitely today's most interesting case," a nurse commented as she adjusted his IV. "Bear attacks in this area are pretty rare, especially ones where the person walks away with relatively minor injuries." "I wouldn't exactly call it an attack," Greg clarified, repeating Ranger Wilson's assessment. "More like, I was in its way. It was focused on the salmon, not on me." By early evening, Greg had been moved to a room for overnight observation, standard protocol for wilderness animal bites. Diane had been contacted and was already driving from Seattle, having received his initial text hours earlier but unable to reach him afterward. Ranger Wilson appeared around 8 p.m., carrying Greg's duffel bag from the cabin. "Got your essentials," she said, setting the bag on a chair. "Clothes, toiletries, phone charger, book from the nightstand. I fed that stray cat that was hanging around your porch. Hope that's okay." "Absolutely," Greg smiled. "That's Winston. He adopted the cabin more than me, I think." He gestured to the room's other chair, inviting her to sit. "Any news about the bear?" "We sent a team to the location you described. They found evidence supporting your account. Partially eaten salmon. Some tracks consistent with a medium-sized black bear. No sign of the bear itself, which is actually good news. Means it probably continued its normal behavior pattern after your encounter." She leaned forward slightly. "I've filed the initial report, but we'll need your signature on a formal statement. Tomorrow, if you're up for it." Greg nodded. "Of course, whatever you need." "One more thing," Ranger Wilson added, pulling a business card from her shirt pocket. "Jason Keller from the Port Angeles Tribune called the visitor center, heard about the incident on the scanner, and wants to talk to you for a story. No obligation, of course, just thought you should know." Greg took the card, surprised by the media interest. "A newspaper story, really?" "Local paper always covers human-wildlife encounters," she shrugged. "Especially during tourist season. Reminds people to be careful out there." After Ranger Wilson left, Greg contemplated the reporter's card. The idea of his experience becoming a public story felt strange, almost an invasion of the private relationship he'd developed with the wilderness over decades. Yet he also recognized the potential educational value. If his experience could help someone else avoid a similar situation, perhaps it was worth sharing. He was still weighing this when Diane arrived, her face tight with worry despite his assurances over the phone that he was relatively fine. She burst into the room with the focused energy that characterized her approach to all crises, immediately assessing his condition with her own eyes. "Greg Robert Talbot," she began, using his full name as she did only in moments of high emotion. "When you said bear encounter in your text, I thought maybe you'd spotted one across the river, not that you'd been mauled." "I wasn't mauled," he corrected gently. "It was more of a bump and bite, and it was my fault. I got between it and 30 salmon." Diane moved to his bedside, her hand finding his. Despite her outward exasperation, her touch communicated relief and concern. "The doctor I spoke to said you have a fractured ankle. Hairline fracture. 6 weeks in a walking boot. Some antibiotics. Could have been much worse." Diane sank into the chair Ranger Wilson had vacated. "I always worried about something like this happening. All those solo trips into the backcountry. In 37 years of fishing those rivers, this is the first real problem I've had," Greg reminded her. "And it wasn't in the deep backcountry. I was 4 miles from a visitor center on a popular trail. Their conversation continued in this vein, Diane processing her fear through mild admonishment, Greg providing rational perspective while acknowledging her concerns. It was a familiar pattern, comfortable in its predictability. By the time a nurse came to check Greg's vital signs, they had settled into a gentler exchange, discussing practical matters like Greg's limited mobility in the coming weeks and how it would affect his work schedule. "We'll figure it out," Diane concluded, squeezing his hand. "At least you're still in one piece, more or less." Greg slept fitfully that night, his dreams filled with rushing water and dark shapes moving with startling speed. He woke several times, momentarily disoriented by the hospital surroundings, before the previous day's events came flooding back. Each time he would adjust his position, careful of the IV line and his immobilized ankle, then drift back into uneasy sleep. Morning brought a new rotation of medical staff, fresh assessment of his wounds, and discharge planning. Dr. Mehta returned with good news. The wound cultures showed no immediate signs of concerning bacteria, and the antibiotics appeared to be doing their job. "We'll send you home today with oral antibiotics," she explained. "Continue those for the full course. Don't stop early even if everything seems fine. Follow up with your primary care physician in Seattle next week and with an orthopedist for the fracture." A hospital administrator arrived with paperwork, including incident reports that would be shared with the National Park Service. As Greg signed the forms, a knock at the door revealed a lean man in his 30s wearing a Port Angeles Tribune press badge. "Jason Keller," he introduced himself. "Hope I'm not intruding. Ranger Wilson said she'd passed along my card." Greg glanced at Diane, who shrugged slightly, leaving the decision to him. "Yes, she did. I'm still deciding if I want to talk about it publicly." "I completely understand," Keller replied smoothly. "But I'm already writing a piece on human-wildlife encounters in the park this season. Yours would add an important perspective about safety and awareness. Plus, not everyone walks away from a bear encounter. Your experience could be educational." The reporter's argument echoed Greg's own thoughts from the previous evening. After a moment's consideration, he nodded. "All right, but I want to be clear that this wasn't an attack in the traditional sense. The bear was defending a food source, not hunting me." "Noted," Keller said, pulling out a small recorder. "Mind if I record? Just to make sure I get the details." "Right." Over the next 20 minutes, Greg recounted the experience for what felt like the dozenth time, emphasizing his own role in the encounter, how his focus on fishing had blinded him to the warning signs, how he'd inadvertently positioned himself between predator and prey. Keller asked thoughtful questions about Greg's fishing history, his knowledge of bear behavior, and what he might do differently in the future. "One last question," the reporter said as he concluded the interview. "Has this experience changed how you feel about fishing in bear country? Will you go back?" The question caught Greg off guard. He hadn't consciously considered it yet, too caught up in the immediate aftermath. Would he return to those rivers? The mental image of his lost fly rod drifting downstream suddenly seemed symbolic. "I honestly don't know," he answered truthfully. "I've loved those rivers for most of my life. But yes, something fundamental has shifted. I've always known I was a visitor in their world, but now I've felt it physically." He gestured to his ankle. "I'll have to see how I feel when this heals." Keller thanked him and departed, promising to email a copy of the article when it was published. Diane, who had remained quietly in the corner during the interview, moved to sit on the edge of Greg's bed. "You really don't know if you'll go back?" she asked, surprise evident in her voice. "I thought you'd be planning your return before the boot comes off." Greg considered her question more deeply. "It's not fear, exactly. More like a reassessment. For decades I've gone into those woods feeling like I understood the rules, like I belonged there in some fundamental way. Now, I'm not so sure." Discharge processes occupied the next few hours. A physical therapist demonstrated proper use of the walking boot and crutches. Prescriptions were filled at the hospital pharmacy. Greg changed into fresh clothes from his cabin, his fishing clothes now sealed in a hospital bag, still damp and bearing the distinct odor of river water and lingering fear sweat. Ranger Wilson appeared one final time as they were preparing to leave, carrying a clipboard with official National Park Service forms. "Just need your signature on this incident report," she explained. "Everything you told us, plus our observations on site. It becomes part of our wildlife management database." Greg reviewed and signed the document. The ranger added, We've already had several people at the visitor center asking about the bear attack. Word travels fast in a small community. Great, Greg sighed. I hope you're setting the record straight. Absolutely, we emphasize that this was defensive behavior, not predatory. We're using it as a teaching moment about giving wildlife space, especially around food sources. She hesitated, then added, For what it's worth, I think you handled it well, all things considered. Many people freeze completely in these situations. You kept your head. The compliment warmed Greg unexpectedly. Thanks, doesn't feel like I handled it well, given the outcome. You're alive with relatively minor injuries after a physical encounter with a bear, Ranger Wilson pointed out. I'd call that a win. The drive back to Seattle took over 3 hours, with Diane at the wheel of her Volvo. They had arranged for Greg's Subaru to be towed back to the city later that week. The familiar journey allowed time for reflection as they wound through the Olympics, Peninsula's varied landscapes, from dense rainforest to the shimmering waters of the Hood Canal, and finally across Puget Sound via the Kingston Edmonds ferry. Greg watched the shoreline recede from the ferry's passenger deck, his leg propped on a spare seat, mind still full of rushing water and sudden motion. Diane brought him coffee from the galley, settling beside him in companionable silence. I'm thinking about trying golf, Greg said suddenly. Diane turned to him, eyebrows raised. Golf? You've always said golf was fishing without the honesty or the scenery. Maybe I've been unfair to golf, he shrugged. It's outdoors. It involves skill and patience, and the wildlife is generally limited to squirrels and geese, neither of which is likely to fracture my ankle. The joke hung between them, neither fully laughing, both recognizing the serious undercurrent. Greg wasn't just talking about recreational preferences, he was processing a fundamental shift in his relationship with wilderness. Diane reached over and took his hand, squeezing gently. No words were necessary. Back in Seattle, their Ballard home felt almost foreign after the intensity of the previous 36 hours. The familiar rooms, Greg's home office with its neat stacks of client folders, their kitchen with the copper pots hanging above the island, the living room with its wall of bookshelves, all seemed to belong to a different life, one untouched by the raw reality of tooth and claw. Greg settled into his recliner, elevating his ankle as instructed, while Diane moved efficiently through the house, handling practical matters, arranging pillows, preparing a simple dinner, calling Greg's office to explain his upcoming absence, contacting their adult children to assure them their father was okay, despite the alarming headlines they might see. Lisa wants to video chat, Diane reported, returning from one such call with their daughter who lived in Chicago. She says she needs to see for herself that you're not mauled beyond recognition. Tell her the mauling was quite recognizable, Greg joked weakly. But yes, let's call her after dinner. That evening established the pattern for the days that followed. Greg adapted to his temporary limitations, working remotely when possible, delegating client meetings to his associates, and navigating the house with an increasingly confident crutch technique. Diane hovered less with each passing day, returning to her own routines while remaining attentive to Greg's needs. 5 days after the encounter, Jason Keller's article appeared in the Port Angeles Tribune. Diane brought the paper to Greg's office, where he had set up a temporary command center to minimize movement through the house. Page 3, she said, handing him the newspaper. With a photo. The headline read, Close Encounter, Seattle Man Survives Bear Bite While Fishing Hoh River. Below it was a generic stock photo of a black bear, not the specific animal from Greg's encounter. The article itself was surprisingly measured, accurately conveying the defensive nature of the interaction and incorporating Ranger Wilson's educational points about wildlife safety. A sidebar, titled Man vs. Nature Round 2, provided statistics on bear encounters in Olympic National Park over the past decade, contextualizing Greg's experience as rare but not unprecedented. It's not bad, Greg conceded after reading it twice. At least he didn't sensationalize it too much. I've already had 3 neighbors text me about it, Diane informed him. Karen next door wants to bring over a casserole, as if you've had a death in the family. Greg smiled despite himself. Tell her I'm recovering from a bear bite, not appetite loss. The minor local fame lasted about a week. A few clients called with concern and curiosity. His children shared the article on social media, generating brief flurries of comments and questions. A fly fishing forum he frequented posted the story, prompting a discussion about wildlife awareness while wading. Then, as with most news, the world moved on to fresher narratives. What didn't fade was Greg's internal processing of the event. The prescribed 6 weeks in the walking boot gave him ample time to consider his relationship with wilderness recreation. He found himself browsing golf equipment online, researching courses around Seattle, even watching instructional videos on proper swing technique. Diane observed these activities with curious amusement, but offered no commentary beyond practical questions about storage space for potential new equipment. During his 3rd week of recovery, Greg unpacked his fishing gear from the Subaru, which had finally been towed back from the Olympic Peninsula. Most items were still damp, developing the musty smell of equipment left too long in waterproof bags. He laid everything out in the garage: vest, net, fly boxes, wading shoes. The waders themselves, premium breathable Sims G3s that had cost nearly $500, bore the evidence of their life-saving role. The neoprene foot section of the left leg showed a distinct arc of puncture marks, the material torn but not penetrated completely, thanks to the additional layer of the wading boot. Greg ran his fingers over the damage, feeling the distinct tooth pattern that matched the slowly healing marks on his own ankle. After a moment's contemplation, he hung the waders on a hook at the far end of the garage wall, not with his other gear, but separate, like a trophy or memorial. When Diane found him there an hour later, still staring at the suspended waders, she slipped her arm around his waist and leaned her head against his shoulder. "You're going to keep them," she observed. It wasn't a question. "Seems wrong to throw them away," Greg replied. "They did their job." Diane nodded against his shoulder. "Your fishing website had a sale on new waders in their email this morning. I noticed you deleted it without opening it." Greg hadn't consciously registered this action, but he recognized the truth in her observation. "I'm not ready to replace them yet. Maybe not ever." "That's okay," she said simply. "People change. Interests change." The following weekend, Greg used a single crutch to navigate the Interbay Golf Center, a public 9-hole course in Seattle. He couldn't play yet, but he wanted to absorb the atmosphere and rhythms of this potential new hobby. He watched players of various skill levels, noted the social dynamics of foursomes versus solo players, and assessed the physical demands against his eventual recovery expectations. It wasn't the Hoh River. The carefully manicured landscape lacked the wild beauty and sense of ancient continuity that had drawn Greg to fishing for nearly 4 decades. The artificial ponds and strategic plantings felt engineered rather than evolved. But there was outdoor air on his face, purpose in the player's movements, and a distinct absence of apex predators. It offered a different kind of peace. As fall progressed into early winter, Greg's physical recovery continued without complications. The fracture healed cleanly, and the puncture wounds closed without infection, though they left a distinctive crescent of small scars that would likely remain for life. His orthopedist cleared him to remove the boot at the 6-week mark, transitioning to an ankle brace for additional support during the final healing phase. "You've got a great story for the grandkids someday," the doctor commented while examining the healing bite marks. "Not many people can show off authentic bear scars." Greg had smiled politely, but the comment struck him as trivializing an experience that had affected him far beyond the physical marks. The encounter had forced a reevaluation of assumptions he'd held for most of his adult life, about his place in the natural world, about the boundaries between human and wild spaces, about the activities that defined his identity outside of work and family. By December, Seattle had settled into its typical winter pattern of persistent gray skies and occasional drenching rains. Greg had returned to full duties at his accounting firm, the bear encounter becoming a background note in office small talk rather than a defining characteristic. He'd purchased basic golf equipment, clubs, shoes, gloves, appropriate attire, and had taken 3 lessons at an indoor facility, laying groundwork for more serious pursuit in spring. He had not, however, acquired new fishing gear to replace what had been lost in the Hoh River. His fishing magazines remained unread, gathering dust on his nightstand. The calendar alert for the annual Fly Fishing Expo in January appeared on his phone, and he dismissed it without the usual automatic RSVP. One evening in mid-December, as rain lashed against the windows of their Ballard home, Diane found Greg in his office, laptop open to a browser window displaying luxury fishing lodges in Alaska. "Planning a trip?" she asked, setting a mug of tea on his desk. Greg shook his head. "Just browsing, old habit." He closed the laptop. "How ridiculous would it be to sell all my fishing gear? I've got enough to stock a small shop." Diane considered the question seriously. Not ridiculous at all, if you're sure you're done with it. But there's no rush to decide, is there? It's not in the way. No, Greg agreed. No rush. That night, Greg dreamed of the Ho River for the first time since the immediate aftermath of the encounter. In the dream, he stood midstream in golden evening light casting rhythmically toward a seam in the current. His movements were fluid, practiced, joyful. On the far bank, partially obscured by riverside vegetation, the dark shape of a bear moved parallel to him, neither approaching nor retreating, simply occupying its own space in their shared landscape. The dream held no fear, only a sense of profound rightness, of boundaries respected and distances maintained. He woke before dawn, the dream images still vivid. Outside, the December rain continued steadily, drumming on the roof and streaming down the windows. Greg lay awake, considering the dream's symbolism, its feeling of proper relationship restored. Later that morning, over coffee, he mentioned the dream to Diane. "Sounds like your subconscious processing," she suggested, "finding a way to reconcile your love of fishing with what happened." "Maybe," Greg nodded. It felt important somehow, like something had been resolved. "Do you think you'll fish again?" Diane asked directly, watching his face. Greg considered the question carefully. "Yes," he said finally, "but differently, more carefully, more humbly, I guess." 3 months after the encounter, the physical evidence had largely faded. Greg's ankle had regained most of its strength and flexibility, though it still occasionally ached before weather changes, a common aftermath of fractures that often became a lifelong barometric indicator. The scars from the bear's teeth had faded from angry red to pale pink, forming a permanent crescent on his lower leg. In late January, Greg finally opened the fishing magazine that had been sitting untouched on his nightstand. He read it cover to cover, noting gear innovations and technique articles with his old interest, but viewing the adventure stories with a newly critical eye. The writer's bravado about wilderness experiences struck him as naive now, missing essential respect for the true wildness they claimed to seek. He began researching guided fishing trips for the coming spring, not solo excursions to remote rivers, but professionally led experiences on waters where multiple anglers and guides created a human presence that wildlife generally avoided. He mentioned these investigations to Diane casually, testing both her reaction and his own feelings as the words formed. "Snake River in Idaho might be good," he commented over dinner one evening. "Well-established guide services, less dense bear population than the Olympic Peninsula." Diane paused, fork halfway to her mouth. "You're thinking about a fishing trip?" "Considering it," Greg clarified. "For May or June, when the weather's reliable, with guides, not alone." "That sounds reasonable," she replied carefully. "And golf, is that still in the picture?" "Both, I think. Different outlets for different days." February brought an unexpected postcard from Ranger Wilson, who had apparently looked up their Seattle address. The image showed a black bear fishing in a river, not the specific bear from Greg's encounter, but similar in size and coloration. Her message was brief but meaningful. "Hope you're healing well. The rivers here miss your respectful presence. Ranger C. Wilson." The small gesture touched Greg deeply. He propped the postcard on his office desk, a reminder that his decades of responsible wilderness use had not gone unnoticed, and that one traumatic encounter needn't erase that positive history. By March, Greg had committed fully to a dual recreational path. He joined a golf club with a course just 15 minutes from their home, establishing a regular Saturday morning tea time with a group of similarly skilled beginners. The social aspect surprised him pleasantly, the easy camaraderie of shared struggle with a difficult sport, the gentle ribbing over missed putts, the post-round analysis over coffee or beer. Simultaneously, he researched and booked a guided fishing trip for early June on Idaho's South Fork of the Snake River, where cutthroat trout would be active in the post-runoff clarity. The outfitter emphasized safety protocols and group dynamics in a way that appealed to Greg's revised priorities. No solo wilderness heroics, just responsible enjoyment with professional oversight. When he finally purchased new waders to replace the bear-damaged pair, Greg chose a different brand and color than his previous equipment. The change felt symbolic, a fresh start, a new relationship with the activity. The damaged waders remained hanging in the garage, not as a fearful reminder, but as a respect-inducing milestone, like the scars on his ankle. 1 full year after the bear encounter, Greg stood once again in moving water, this time in the Yakima River, just 2 hours from Seattle. He had chosen this location deliberately for his return to Washington waters, a river with excellent trout fishing, but situated in the eastern, more arid part of the state, where black bear populations were considerably sparser than in the lush Olympic Peninsula. The familiar weight of waders, the gentle pressure of current against his legs, the rhythmic casting motion, all felt simultaneously like returning home and entering new territory. Greg moved with heightened awareness, scanning banks and surrounding vegetation with regular sweeps of his gaze. His fishing was interrupted every few casts by these environmental checks, a new habit that reduced his total focus on the water, but integrated him more thoroughly into the complete landscape. He caught and released several respectable rainbow trout that day, each one bringing genuine satisfaction, but without the competitive edge that had sometimes characterized his previous angling. His goal had shifted subtly from maximizing catch to optimizing experience. The quality of each cast, the beauty of each drift, the privilege of temporary participation in the river's complex ecosystem. As evening approached and Greg prepared to wade back to shore, he noticed movement on the far bank. Not a bear this time, but a coyote moving with deliberate grace along the water's edge. The animal paused, seeming to consider Greg's presence, then continued on its path, disappearing into riverside brush without alarm. The brief moment of mutual acknowledgement sparked a memory of his dream from months earlier, predator and human occupying shared space with appropriate boundaries. Greg smiled to himself as he carefully navigated the rocky riverbed toward shore. The wilderness had changed for him, or rather, his perception of it had evolved. The mythic quality had been replaced by something more honest, an appreciation of wild spaces as they actually existed, complete with tooth and claw beauty and danger in equal measure. That night, staying at a small motel in Ellensburg, Greg called Diane to report on his successful return to Washington waters. "So it felt okay?" she asked, the concern in her voice evident despite the casual phrasing. "Being back in a river?" "Better than okay," Greg answered honestly. "It felt right. Different but right. No bears, I assume, or I'd have heard about that first." "No bears," he confirmed. "But I saw a coyote. We had a moment." Diane laughed softly. "A moment with appropriate distance, I hope." "Absolutely. We've all learned our lessons." As they talked, Greg absently traced the crescent of scars on his ankle, visible beneath the hem of his shorts. The physical reminder would remain with him always, as would the memory of that moment of primal connection, the bear's dark eyes meeting his across the water. Two species whose paths crossed too closely, in a landscape belonging fully to neither. The Port Angeles Tribune article had long since been recycled, the minor local fame completely faded. What remained was more valuable, a hard-earned wisdom about coexistence, about the proper relationship between human recreation and wild inhabitants. Greg had entered the Olympic Peninsula that September morning as an experienced fisherman with decades of wilderness time, but perhaps with a subtle arrogance about his place in that world. He had emerged with something more nuanced, a deeper respect, a more careful approach, and yes, a healthier fear. The torn waders still hung in his garage, testament to both danger encountered and disaster averted. His new set had already accumulated the honorable dirt of several rivers. His golf clubs showed the wear of regular use. His accounting practice continued to thrive. Life had absorbed and integrated the bear encounter, making it not an ending but a shifting point, a recalibration. In the years that followed, Greg would return to many familiar waters, though never again to that specific stretch of the Hoh River. He spoke occasionally to fishing clubs and community groups about wilderness safety, showing his scars and recounting his experience with neither drama nor minimization. His story became one small thread in the region's ongoing conversation about human-wildlife interaction, perhaps preventing similar incidents through increased awareness. And somewhere in the dense forests of the Olympic Peninsula, a black bear continued its ancient patterns, foraging, hunting, fishing the salmon runs, avoiding humans when possible, defending resources when necessary. Neither villain nor innocent, simply a bear being precisely what evolution had designed it to be. Greg understood this now in a way that transcended intellectual knowledge, carried in his body's permanent memory of tooth-meeting flesh, of worlds colliding briefly before separating again into their proper spheres. The wilderness remained wild, the human returned, changed but welcome. The distance between them, properly maintained, allowed both to thrive.